Animation. One of the most advanced forms of art because it is a combination of so many skills. It shows your understanding of space, movement, and acting. And not to mention, it is incredibly tedious since you often need to draw every single frame. And that could mean 24 full drawings for a single second of animation. Despite this, the hard work that goes into a hand-drawn animation gives such satisfying results. I've tried my hand at small animations before, but was always too daunted to really dip my toes deep. So what if I told you that I made this animated illustration in Clip Studio Paint with only one drawing? Hi, Qilin here. In this tutorial, I'll share my process and techniques of how I created it. I'm starting with my initial sketch idea of my character with a moth on her face. My first step pretty much involves just looking at my sketch and figuring out what kinds of animated elements I'm thinking of including in the final illustration. All these imagined movements means that there will likely be a lot of moving parts. And this is the key. When drawing your illustration, don't be afraid of using lots of layers. This allows you to separate and group illustration elements, which will make the later animating process a lot easier. I have layer folders for each big group, like moth, character, and background. And within those layer groups are specific parts, like hair top, hair bottom, and etc. Grouping layers accordingly before animating will help declutter the timeline workspace a lot and make things way easier to find. You don't have to rename all your layers, but it does help if you have a lot and need an easy way to track them. This stage is very much all about organization, but also don't be too pressured to make things perfect. It's likely that you'll have to adjust things or come up with new parts you want to animate, or overcome other unexpected obstacles during the animation process. So just draw and group layers according to what you think is right and what you think will help you the most. Let's set up the animation workspace. Open up the animation timeline under Window, Timeline, and from there create a new timeline. For frame rate, 12 or 24 are standards in animation, but I'm just gonna pick 12 for simplicity. If you want to export the animation as a GIF, the maximum is 12 frames anyway. For playback time, at this point I haven't decided how long I want it to be. I know it definitely won't be longer than 100 frames, which is more than 8 seconds, but I can easily cut this down later using these blue toggles in the timeline. As for everything else, I'll leave them as is. Once the timeline is created, you can see that all the layers are ordered the same as in the layer window. Now everything is set up and ready. I'm gonna start by animating the moth. In this section, I'll be introducing the main animation technique that I'll be using for the rest of the tutorial, keyframe animation. I'm gonna begin by preparing my moth layers by rotating and repositioning them within the keyframes. On this first wing layer, I'm gonna click Enable Keyframes on this layer. Then I'm gonna select the beginning point, which is frame 1, and click Add Keyframe. You should see a diamond appear on the timeline. I'm gonna use the Object tool and make sure I have the right layer selected. A blue box will pop up with some familiar transform controls. Since I want to rotate the moth, I'm going to key in the value -30 under the rotation angle parameter in the Tool Properties window. Now the layer is rotated at the right angle that I want, and I'm going to do the exact same for every moth layer. Enable keyframes, add keyframe, and rotate -30. When the moth's entire body is rotated at the angle I want, I'm gonna select the layer group and adjust its positioning. Before doing anything else, I went back to the first keyframe of each layer and adjusted the anchor points so that the wings will be anchored to the center of the moth's body and the antenna to be centered to the moth's head. If you're wondering why I didn't just rotate the entire moth layer group instead of rotating each layer, This is because weird things happen when rotating a group of layers that use scaling parameters, which I'll be using later. So I found this to be the best way to get the result I need. I can start actually animating the wings now. I have 4 wing layers split into top right, top left, bottom right, and bottom left. I'm gonna click ahead in the timeline and add another keyframe. In Tool Properties, I'll uncheck Keep Aspect Ratio and change the width to 2. This creates 1/2 of the flapping motion and makes the wing look like it's folding up. To make it complete the movement, I'll select the first keyframe and duplicate it and move it to the end. You can do this by holding left click and Alt and dragging the keyframe. I'm gonna do the exact same thing for each of the wing layers. I split up the wings into 4 layers so I could also adjust the timing so that there's a bit of delay in the lower half of the wings for a more natural look. The antenna come next. I have 2 antenna layers, one for the left and one for the right. On the left antenna, this time I'm going to the rotation angle parameter and adjusting the value so that it'll rotate downwards a little bit. You can see me fiddle a lot with the timing of the keyframes, but in essence, I was just trying to get it to move up and down by duplicating the first 2 keyframes to fill the whole timeline. I did the same for the other antenna. If you want movement to loop smoothly, make sure that your last keyframe is the same as the first keyframe so that the movements will connect. And finally, for the moth, I wanted to try make some effects animation, where some shiny dust falls when the moth flaps its wings. I'm first using this effects brush to draw some shiny dust, then using the lasso tool to pick parts from the stamp to make 4 dust layers. This is so I can animate different dust particles falling at different timings, just to look a bit more natural. This time, I'm using keyframes to make changes to the position parameter by dragging the dust downwards to make it look like it's falling. To make the dust suddenly appear, I'm creating 2 keyframes right next to each other. The first has the opacity at 0, and the second has the opacity at 100. To make the dust disappear at the end of the motion, I'm doing the opposite, but the only difference is I'm spacing out the keyframes so the dust fades away rather than suddenly disappearing. Do be aware that you have to click the plus sign on your timeline layer to view and edit opacity keyframes. You can see me playing around and testing different keyframe positions, eventually reaching a point where the dust falls and disappears at different timings. You might notice something different about the keyframe color here. This is because I changed the type of keyframe interpolation from its default, which is smooth interpolation, into linear interpolation. Essentially what it changes is the way the dust falls, so when using smooth interpolation, the speed begins slowly, then quickly, then slowly again. When using linear interpolation, it moves at a constant speed. Smooth interpolation is great for varied and natural movements, which is why I'm using it throughout the whole animation, but in the case of something falling, it would be more natural for it to fall at a constant speed. Animating the eyes is the easiest way to give life to a character. I wanted to make her look around and shift between a relaxed and surprised expression. First up, the irises. When you observe a person's eyes, the irises can move quick and choppy. With this in mind, I'm being very careful about the exact positioning of the irises in my keyframes to imitate that choppy look. When keyframes are right next to each other, i.e. keyframe 1 to 2, there's no room for Clip Studio Paint to automate and fill in the in-between movements. This helps me get my choppy movement. When the iris settles in one position of no movement, I'm making sure to duplicate the same keyframe and allow space in between them so the iris can hold its position. I'm also putting most of the iris animation during the parts where the moth isn't moving its wings, so it gives the impression that the eyes are reacting to the moth. And to keep the irises within the boundary, I'm setting the iris layer as a clipping mask so that it's restrained within the eye white layer. This part took a lot of testing and playing around to see what movement I liked the best. For the rest of the eye movement, I split up my eyelash layers into 4, 2 for the top lashes and 2 for the bottom lashes. This is so I could animate the eyes separately since her face is not at a straight ahead angle. Starting with the left side eye, I'm doing the same as before, enabling keyframes, adjusting the anchor point to be in the center of her eye, and manipulating the positioning and scaling of the top eyelashes. I'm starting with the surprised expression since her eyes were already wide open. Here I'm using an animation technique called overshooting, which helps to exaggerate movements. It's a really simple technique that, in this case, only takes one additional keyframe. To make her relaxed expression, I'm making her eyelids close more by adjusting position and scale, and putting this keyframe at the start and end of the timeline so the movement loops smoothly. When I'm done with the eyelash and lid situation, I'm using the same keyframe technique to align the eye whites so there's no overlap. And here's how the finished eyes look. More and more small animations are being added to my illustration. It feels a little like witchcraft, bringing an illustration to life like this. I had an idea just to have her arm and index finger move slightly, but unfortunately I didn't plan this far ahead when drawing, which meant that I needed to separate the arm into 3 pieces. I did this by using the lasso tool and cutting up the arm layer. To prevent possible gaps in the animation, I added extra blocks of color to the arm and finger and have them hide behind the hand layer. Now I can repeat the same keyframe animation technique as before. I don't want the movement to be too erratic, so I'm only changing the angle very slightly and spreading the keyframe across the whole timeline so the movement is slow and smooth. After the hand and finger were done, I keyframe animated the arm layer group so the entire arm moves, and that the hand animation also follows the whole arm's rotation. All in all, animating the entire arm, including cutting up the pieces, took less than 10 minutes. I left the hair mostly to the last since it has the most parts on my character. The bigger layer groups were organized by the top, the midsection, and the back section. The floaty strands were also organized by top and back. I'm starting with the midsection, which I quickly realized needed to be split up into 2 parts. Before starting my animation, I did some additional drawing to fill in gaps, and adjusted the layer order so the right side hair was hidden behind the head. I'm doing the same keyframe animation technique as before, enabling keyframes, adjusting any anchor points, and adjusting the rotation angle parameter in tool properties to create a swaying movement. I'm going back and forth between adjusting the timing and adjusting the redraw, and checking to make sure I'm satisfied with everything. The top of the hair comes next. I spent some time figuring out the best way to separate the layers for animation, and I ended up splitting each floating strand and made selections in the main hair to create a left side, a right side, and the scalp. This would make it easier to connect any gaps that were visible after animation. Same as before, I'm enabling keyframes, adjusting the anchor points, and using the rotation keyframes for all the parts. I'm checking that all gaps are filled and connected. Though it sounds tedious to fill in gaps, it was actually really easy just by using the liquify tool. I'm making sure to adjust the keyframe positions so there's some off timing for visual interest, and I did this until I was satisfied with the results. The back of the hair was more of the same. I split it up into two and split up each one of the back strands. Rotation keyframe animation was used for each one to create that same swaying movement. If this is sounding repetitive, that's because it is. So far, I've been making all the hair pieces sway to the right, but for the back, I decided to have the animation have opposite rotations so I wouldn't have to do so much gap filling. If you have a group of parts like the hair strands that are gonna be animated in the same way, you can vary your parameter numbers so that there's a range of smaller and bigger movements. Now the character animation is done. My clip file is turning huge, and with every save I literally need to pray to a higher entity so that my computer won't crash. Completely my fault for having the original file be so huge to begin with, so I advise you to make yours smaller. But I just want to do one more addition, a pulsing light coming from the Moth. I don't think my computer can handle much more, so I had to make it simple. I'm using a big airbrush to draw some soft light. Then using a harder brush, drawing some more exact shapes in her face and shoulder. After making some opacity keyframes and checking how I liked the animation, I duplicated them in the timeline to make the whole animation repeat. I can turn off enable keyframes so I can adjust the layer itself to make any other additions, which is what I did, adding some light into her hair. And as a final touch, I'm using the same effects brush from when I animated the falling moth dust and generously drawing it onto the illustration. And here is the final animation, once again, in case you missed it at the beginning. This tutorial turned out so much longer than I expected, so I really appreciate anyone who stayed for this long. Please also check out my tutorial on the Clip Studio tips page, and let me know what you thought in the comments, and whether or not you tried these techniques for yourself, and thanks a lot for looking!